So before I begin, I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers, Professor Brier, Florian, Soyun, Sibren, for facilitating this opportunity for the exchange of ideas, and also to the attendees for their challenging presentations. So I would say my understanding of Spinoza has definitely been amended, right, especially on the detail of personalization in finite subjects in the TDIE. So now I desire to return the favor, right, hopefully of the rational kind in Proposition 51 or Part 4 with my reading of Spinoza. So today I will be assessing the significance of Spinoza's remarks regarding attaining knowledge of human lack of power or impotentia, which I believe to be the object of intuitive knowledge for human freedom or beatitude. But to see why this is the case, let us recall that the last two parts of the ethics treat opposing subject matters, right? In part 4, we have human bondage or slavery, where human reason is impotent against the passive affects. And in part 5, we have human freedom or beatitude, where human reason possesses a peculiar power over the passive affects. So for Spinoza, human freedom, salvation, or beatitude consists in the intellectual love of God as an active affect that arises from intuitive knowledge. Simultaneously, intuitive knowledge also begets the greatest satisfaction of mind, which as a rational species of acquiescentia in se ipso, currently translated in English as self-esteem, is the highest thing we can hope for. When we contrast part 5 with part 4, these are the most important effects for Spinoza's therapy for human bondage because, firstly, they are the most powerful of the effects and the most stable of the effects. So most of the time, they are sufficiently powerful to overwhelm passive affections that lead us to act against ourselves. But in other cases where we are still overwhelmed, given our finite nature, the stability of these active effects would still, at least outlast the passive effects with time. But of course, we should not discount Spinoza's maxims for living, but I wish to focus on the beatitude that comes with our true peace of mind, vera, animi, acquiescentia, that arises from intuitive knowledge. So I think that the question that appears to be unanswered in part 5 seems to be, what singular things should we know adequately for our freedom? So I think this is somewhat puzzling because this is a book that aims to lead us by the hand, to our highest blessedness. And to be sure, I think most of us believe that Spinoza is not one to abandon us when we need him the most, especially for a philosopher of friendship, when it concerns our beatitude. So I think there are also many reasonable responses to this question from the ethics, right? The most obvious option is that the object of intuitive knowledge is God. Right, many passages in Spinoza's writings suggest this, right, especially in Proposition 28 of Part 4, right, where he says very clearly that knowledge of God is the mind's greatest good, its greatest virtue is to know God. So while there's, I think, nothing obviously wrong with this answer, I think some details do not add up. So for starters, Spinoza tells us that we already possess an adequate knowledge of God in Proposition 47 or Part 2. So what this means is that there is no need to really acquire a knowledge of God, or rather it is false to speak of acquiring knowledge of God as if we do not possess it in the first place. So I would also like to note that Spinoza speaks of our possession of knowledge rather than an idea of God, right, because it is not only impossible for finite modes to possess such an infinite idea, but also because God is not a res, right, but an ens, as the dynamic and active ground of intelligibility, as Stephen Daniels so recently reminded us. So furthermore, if we do not already possess adequate knowledge of God, I think it would be quite difficult to make sense of Spinoza's definition of intuitive knowledge, because it describes an epistemological procedure, right, from proceeding from an adequate knowledge of God, right, of his attributes to singular things. And I think this would also explain why Spinoza says that the more we understand singular things, the more we understand God. So therefore, the absolute ideal of intuitive knowledge is the ideal idea of God, but of course, being finite, we must be content only with the intuitive knowledge of a great many singular things. And I think this proposition also seems to suggest that attaining intuitive knowledge of any singular thing in sufficient quantity seems to be enough for the purposes of human freedom. But I do not think this is what Spinoza was actually suggesting, because in the general definitions of the affects, Spinoza insists that, and I quote, "The excellence of ideas and the mind's actual power of thinking are measured by the excellence of the object." So, given our finite nature, there must be certain things that we should know intuitively and others where we should not waste any time on. So, or rather, maybe there should be some principle or criteria that allows us to discern what we should know intuitively for our freedom. So what are these singular things and what could this principle be? And here I suggest that the remarks where Spinoza speaks about knowing human impotentia are clues for answering this question. And to already begin with my conclusion, I really think that these singular things that we should intuitively know for our freedom are nothing but the passive affects. And the reason why it should be the passive affects is because they constitute human impotentia. And in another formulation, the object of intuitive knowledge for human freedom or beatitude is nothing but human impotentia, and this is given another name, which is the passive affects in the first 20 propositions of part 5. But because I know this sounds quite outrageous, I will admit that this formulation, the object of intuitive knowledge for human freedom or beatitude is nothing but impotentia, is a confused manner of speaking by Spinoza's standards. So as we are all familiar here, Spinoza shared deep reservations regarding like beings of reason or imagination and was very averse to privative notions such as evil, as we know from his letters to Blienberg. And because reality is perfection without further qualification, what makes this doubly problematic, I think, is the fact that human impotentia or the passive affects are both confused or inadequate ideas, right? Human impotentia is inadequate by virtue of some comparison with a model, and passive affects are inadequate ideas themselves by virtue of their partial nature. So, of course, I would propose a more adequate formulation, which would follow the axiom 4, part 1, which would say that the object of intuitive knowledge for human freedom or beatitude should be nothing but the causes of human impotentia or the passive affects. While maybe slightly less controversial and many further questions could still be raised, I would like to address 3 questions today due to lack of time, but also in tandem with my assessment of Spinoza's remarks. And so firstly, and I think it's the most obvious one, is it legitimate to identify all the passive affects with human impotentia, right? According to the widely popular Deleuzian reading, some passive joys do indicate an increase in power, which can aid us in becoming active, right, as long as they're not too excessive. And for me, I think that the answer to this question would then have to depend on the scope of what Spinoza takes to be human impotentia. And secondly, does Spinoza actually claim that we should know the causes of the passive affects? As we all know, much of Spinoza's therapy of the passions in the first part of Book 5 are subject to intense debate, and his terse writing style doesn't really help us much here, because we will then have to see what does it really mean to form a clear and distinct idea of an affect, at least for proposition 3. And lastly, we should also ask if this formulation, I think, is whether is it too restrictive or not, right? Because if we are only pursuing knowledge of the causes of our human impotentia or the passive affects for human freedom or beatitude, can we square this up with, let's say, Spinoza's equal concern, right, for scientific knowledge and the progression of the sciences and so on? So I think to answer these questions and to lend further support to my interpretation, let us turn to the remarks in part 4 of the Ethics and their context to see if and why Spinoza identifies human impotentia as the passive affects. So if you refer to the handout, right, just in quotations C and E, These remarks appear, I think, in two crucial propositions of part 4. So, firstly, in the scholium to proposition 17, where Spinoza declares that he had explained the impotence of reason against inadequate ideas in the previous 17 propositions, and the demonstration to proposition 53, where Spinoza proves that humility is not a virtue. Very briefly, the scholium to proposition 17 is often adduced as evidence for Spinoza's deep concern for human finitude, usually as a foil against the popular interpretations of Spinoza as a philosopher of wanton joy or power. But in contrast, I think many of us here know that the demonstration for 53 has received a lot more attention because it's associated with the affects, the cluster of affects that is associated with acquiescentia in se ipso. So you have pride, humility, and all of the most devastating affects that Sebren has spoken about earlier today. So, and I think here you can already catch a glimpse of my reasoning, right? Because I believe that Spinoza's prescription for knowledge of human impotentia maps onto the therapy for the passions and for producing rational acquiescentia in se ipso. And this is the part I think would get a little exciting unless I'm wrong. But so before I get ahead of myself, I will just assess the scholium first. So here I quote, "With this I believe I have shown why men are moved more by opinion than by true reason, and why the true knowledge of good and evil arouses disturbances of the mind and often yields to lust of every kind. I do not say these things in order to infer that it is better to be ignorant than to know, or that there is no difference between the fool and the man who understands when it comes to moderating the affects. My reason, rather, is that it is necessary to come to know both our nature's power and its lack of power, so that we can determine what reason can do in moderating the affects and what it cannot do." And end quote. So I think the question that was bothering me was that why was it necessary for Spinoza to know both our nature's power and its lack of power? Or rather, why was it necessary for him to treat our lack of power first before the power of reason? And of course, on one level, we can say that it's a rhetorical maneuver, and then also on another level, we could also say that he needs some of the propositions in part 4 to prove some of the propositions in part 5. But I want to suggest, I think, a reason immanent to the ethics. Like if Spinoza were to demonstrate, let's say, the power of reason first, without discussing the conditions of human impotence, I think it would actually expose us to all the dangers associated with thinking that we have an absolutely free exercise of our reason. So if we consider what Spinoza has told us in the TDIE, the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, right, where we possess, when we possess an objective essence of a true idea, it already guarantees our certainty that we can build intellectual tools ad infinitum, right, from given true ideas, and that we can somehow reconstruct a real definition of God. We can grasp actual infinity, and much of this resurfaces in the ethics, right, where we already even have possession of these adequate ideas. But if we compare this to Descartes, right, where constant human error requires us to verify the reliability of our understanding, or where our finite intellect can only construct models of reality without ever truly knowing infinity, I think Spinoza's conception of reason here is exceptionally powerful. So, when considered on its own, right, in se est, right, reason as the power or conatus of the mind is really a spiritual automaton that will strive to persevere in its being indefinitely. And this is, I think, the way that he treats what many scholars call the second part of Book 5, right? And I think this is no wonder why when he speaks about the eternity of the mind and the intellectual of God, it appears actually quite mystical, simply because he was merely treating the mind without relation to the body. But if we juxtapose this with what Spinoza says about free will in the appendix to part 1, I think we can easily be deluded into thinking that we are free by being satisfied with these powers of reason because of our natural tendency for self-love, like amor sui. But without situating the human individual within the true order of nature, which is what he does in the first 17 propositions of Book 4, right, as a finite mode subjected to incessant determination and limitation, The belief that we have the free use of reason to determine our actions from the affects would then lead to, let's say, more powerful and disastrous affects like pride and all of the other imitative and social affects, which can really be more powerful than affects that arise from knowing things necessarily. And I think this is what Spinoza says in Proposition 5 of Part 5. So what then constitutes the knowledge of human impotentia in Part 4? So I think we can see two levels at work here. So on one level, there is the level of reason, right, as the essence of the mind alone, and two, on the level of the affects that concerns the real modifications of our conatus involving the union of the mind and the body. And for reason, I think the key insight in the preceding 17 propositions here, at least for our purposes, is the fact that we are always determined to act from the affects that arises out of the interactions between powers. So this interaction, or what Spinoza calls comparison, entails that the passive affects will always involve the nature of its causes. So therefore, in the infinite causal web of nature, any existing human being in nature must exist as a dynamic ratio of activity to passivity, and in a nature absolutely infinite, this ratio can always be disrupted by a more powerful external cause. So on this level of human reason, which is merely a finite degree of power, the affects that arise from our adequate ideas can always be weaker in comparison with the passive affects that arise from some relatively more powerful external cause. And this is why reason does not have absolute dominion over the affects in spite of its power to produce adequate ideas. However, I think this is also only a partial explanation befitting the confused notion of impotentia, as I think this is merely a comprehension of the conditions that limit the powers of reason. Instead, I think the root cause of human impotentia must be addressed on the second level, that is, on the level of the affects or the conatus, and it is only revealed by Spinoza in the following proposition, Proposition 18. And I quote here, "A desire which arises from joy is stronger, other things equal, than one which arises from sadness." So what sets Proposition 18 apart from the other 17 propositions that allows it to explain human impotentia? Here I think it is precisely the power of passive joy over any present state of sadness that is the cause for our acting against our own interests. And to speak, let's say, abstractly or inadequately, we can say that there are somehow two factors, right? So the first factor is our weakened state of sadness, where we have a decrease in power of acting or some kind of lack, and then the relatively more powerful external cause that exploits this sadness comparatively to produce that dirty little joy, right, that Deleuze talks about in his lectures. But to speak, let's say, more adequately, the true cause of our impotentia, if we were to follow Spinoza on saying that all true knowledge must be of something really affirmative, is merely passive joy, right? Because it denotes some increase in our power of action. So, in other words, human bondage, as our impotentia, is actually caused by passive joys, but the finite nature of human beings as modes also requires us to be wary, to be cautious about our sadness or weakness that leads to confusion and further misery, right, through the whole mechanism that he discusses in the Appendix 1. And I think this is the reason why I think Spinoza claims that the remedy for the passive affects lies in the knowledge itself of the affects, which I will now examine. So, once again, the most obscure, I think, or maybe the most controversial aspect of Spinoza's therapy of the passions is in Propositions 2 to 4, or Part 5. And the key question, as I've said before, is what does it really mean to form a clear and distinct idea of the affect, and what does it mean to separate the affect from the external cause? So I think some commentators have suggested that it is a conversion of an inadequate idea into an adequate idea, or some scholars take it to mean that we are forming an idea of these affects as expressions of our own bodily modifications, like an idea of an idea. Well, I think these suggestions run into some problems, which I do not have time to discuss, but feel free to ask me about them during the discussion. But in any case, what I want to suggest is that a clear and distinct idea of these affects must involve an idea of their cause as per axiom 4 in Part 1, rather than focusing, let's say, on the bodily modifications alone. And this is what I think Spinoza so briefly hints at in the demonstration to Proposition 53 or Part 5, which I shall now quote, and it's on the handout, I think it's quotation E. So if a man, considering himself, perceives some lack of power of his, this is not because he understands himself, but because his power of acting is restrained, as we have shown in Proposition 55 or Part 3. But if we suppose that the man conceives his lack of power because he understands something more powerful than himself, by the knowledge of which he determines his power of acting, then we conceive nothing but that the man understands himself distinctly, or that his power of acting is aided. Well, Spinoza was denying that humility is a virtue, right, because it is a sadness that arises out of an inadequate idea of ourself. Notice, I think, that Spinoza is suggesting that there can be an adequate idea of one's lack of power that produces active joy. But I think here the key difference between these two ideas, the inadequate and the adequate one, is the fact that the inadequate idea attributes a privation of powers to ourselves, where the adequate idea of the more powerful thing allows us to attribute a negation of powers, right? So instead of imagining that we have lost some power, which we have formerly possessed, the adequate idea here is a cognition of powers that simply do not belong to our essence. And indeed, I think joy arises because every adequate idea implies another adequate idea of itself. And to give an example of how this works, maybe in reality, I think we can think about it as that joyful experience, right, where we realize how skillful our opponent was despite our defeat. So I think it is not so much that we have an adequate knowledge of our impotentia directly, right? Though this is always possible when we compare, let's say, our opponent to ourselves afterwards. But of course, this is no longer adequate by Spinoza's standards. But at least here, we know that we know adequately some stronger power in nature, which is nothing, actually, but rational acquiescentia in se ipso. Now, for me, I was thinking, is this not a concrete example of Spinoza's therapy for the passions? Like, instead of focusing merely just on our bodily affections alone, without attending to its causes, right, which is frankly an inadequate idea of an inadequate idea that Spinoza already warned us in Proposition 29 or Part 2, I think that forming a clear and distinct idea of the affects requires us to adequately know the causes of such an affect, whatever that external thing might be. And every time we cognize the causes of our love, hatred, or any other affect adequately, I think we not only separate the imagined causes of these affects and connect them to other through thoughts as per the true order of nature, which we also know that we know these things adequately as a power proper to the essence of our mind. And I think in the case of human beings, and I think that also this is San Giacomo's point, right? We recognize not only the utility of their powers, right, but their specific manner of existing that indicates levels of agreement among ourselves. And indeed, when we cognize them intuitively as far as we can, which means in the right order, from God to these singular things, we will also be actively participating in the striving that actually constitutes beatitude in the final proposition of the ethics. So on the last point and the last question, right, is this not too restrictive, right? Are we not always bombarded by images and we are always beset on all sides by the vicissitudes of fate and fortune? And if we consistently search for the causes of our affects, like, will we still have time, right, for the natural sciences, such that we can admire, the power and skill of nature in its diversity? And I think we still do. Right? Because these are actually not contrary endeavors in Spinoza. In the absence of final causes and transcendent values, right, where the eternal existence of nature is perfection itself, the only ground of our virtue is our power to persevere in our existence, and to exist in this dynamic nature, right, as a finite mode, requires an understanding of the true utility of things, as is the case in the TDIE, where we understand how the three goods would then be means for us to reach our true good. And I think this means so take, for example, right, our adequate knowledge of the powers of, let's say, avalanches, right, such that we can not only be cautious about how it can cause us sadness, right, but to see the true utility in, let's say, our harmony with the majestic mountains where we could either enjoy a ski trip or, you know, make use of some unique endemic species that might be in the geography. But I think on top of that, there will still always be the rational acquiescentia in se ipso that arises from knowing that we know. So, of course, I would suggest that all scientific knowledge here, right, but of course in the sense of Wissenschaft, right, not in the strict sense of natural sciences that we have today, right, that must include also philosophy, are actually remedies for human impotentia where we progressively adapt things to our use, much like Spinoza's tool analogy in the TDIE. And I think it is because of our striving to persevere in our being as a finite mode, remedying particular human weaknesses, that we begin to think and act, right, rather than, you know, starting from pure wonder alone, as Aristotle suggested in the Metaphysics. And at the same time, I think scientific knowledge here also seems to be the rational activity where human beings actually join in friendship through intellectual generosity as a form of mutual aid towards one another. And for all of Spinoza's criticism of Francis Bacon, perhaps it is also here that we can glimpse his influence summed up in that too often misunderstood aphorism, right? Ipsa scientia potestas est, and I think here, maybe, knowledge for Spinoza is potestas, but a potestas proper to the potentia of human beings. So, to quickly conclude, we shall return to the original question of what are the objects of intuitive knowledge for human freedom. And once again, it must be the passive affects, because if we did not think about them, the stable form of acquiescentia mentis is unthinkable. And we will also be stuck, you know, in our imagination through the constant mechanisms of all of the passive affects that simply lead us to our misery. And at the same time, if we did not think about them and their causes, right, how would we have the conveniences that we experience today, right, just like how Spinoza thought about it in his tool analogy? And far from espousing, let's say, a mundane form of introspection, the requirements of intuitive knowledge, I think it's really a realization or at least a call to action for us to realize the full power of human beings, right, when we attend to the causes of our affections. And here, I think there is no excess or lack, but it is somehow very precise. It is calling for an activity that is the mean between, let's say, passive sadness and the passive excessive joy. So, in some sense, I'm trying to say that there is a really nice, maybe some would consider it Epicurean kind of moderation that we can see here. And once again, I think this is also only true when we are speaking from the perspective of the mind without relation to the body, right? As in part 5, we really see the true power of reason without concern for the passive affects, when we really just grasp intuitively what these singular things are. We really do just have the active affects, because passive affects is always outside and from the body and so on. And I think that this is the very same power that Spinoza has already urged us to exercise as a part of nature in the final section, which is section 32, of the appendix to part 4, which I think that it should be the true end of the ethics, because it really paints a picture of finite activity in its starkness and its glory, right? As glorious as we can be. And here I think this is what Matheron calls Spinoza's stoic moment, right? Which is the furthest that we can go with our power of action, is to know the causes of our passivity as part of nature, to rejoice in knowing that our knowledge is an action that agrees with the order of nature, and be at peace with our existence as finite modes. So, thank you.